Hello and welcome to the Servant Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam Shinta and I'm joined as always by Rick Kite. Each episode we talk with leaders in a variety of fields about character, the common good, and the importance of civic virtue. Hi Rick, how you doing today?
Fine, Sam, just fine.
Well, this just fine.
Just fine.
No better than fine.
How can you be better than fine?
Well, you can be extra fine.
You ever heard of extra fine China? No, you haven't. 'Cause fine China
Extra
is as
fine,
good as
extra
it
fine
gets.
pepper, extra fine salt.
Hey, I'm from Minnesota. Fine is pretty extraordinary, actually. In most places in the world, it would be I'm fantastic. But in Minnesota, it's fine because it's, better than average.
Well, listeners and those watching on YouTube, you might notice a little something different today. Well, the listeners won't, of course, but we are actually in person for our first podcast together since we started doing this back in October of 2020. So it is just wonderful to be in the same room with both Rick and our guest today. Our guest is Thomas Thibodeau. Thomas Thibodeau is the Distinguished Professor of Servant Leadership at Viterbo University, where he has taught since 1984. He has a Master of Arts in Education from St. Mary's College and a BA from St. John's University. Tom is a husband, father, grandfather, teacher, and an active community member who has worked during his career to inspire students and change the world. Through the years, his infectious enthusiasm, compassion, and commitment to leadership and service have also inspired countless colleagues, community members, and leaders across diverse fields. He is the founder of Masters of Arts in Servant Leadership at Viterbo, the first and only master's degree of its kind in the nation, and also a founding member of the Hospitality and Fellowship Resource Place of Grace in La Crosse, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. He is also a part owner of a country tavern and music hall. Welcome, Tom Thibodeau. It is such a great honor to have you on our podcast today.
Well, Sam and Rick, it's always a privilege to be in your presence.
So, Tom, what drew you to this whole concept of servant leadership to begin with? What was that moment that brought you into this idea of servant leadership and service?
In 1975, I'm in graduate school at Seattle University. It was 600 miles north of where I was living. Where I was living, it was Prince George, British Columbia, Canada, where I was a voluntary missionary at that time. So I'm going to graduate school at Seattle University, and I was given the essay, The Servant as Leader. This is 1975. Greenleaf published it first in 1970, and the book was published in 1976 by Paulus Press. And once I read that, it had given vocabulary and an understanding of how I wanted to live the rest of my life. Only later now to begin to understand this is who I always was because of the family that I grew up in, the culture that had shaped me, the education that had given me the privilege to be able to serve and lead others.
So yeah, I think, some of our listeners and viewers will understand what servant leadership is and what the principles are, but maybe you can articulate the essence of servant leadership for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the concept.
I will give you two definitions. One is the definition that Rick Kite and I, Rick, who is sitting here, we've been working on this at Viterbo for 20 years. And a clear way of understanding servant leadership is to engage and inspire other people to work for a greater good every day. The level of engagement is very, very important. Not just to imitate, but to be fully engaged, to make it your own. You have to inspire people. Greenleaf said that every leader needs to be a spirit carrier, in spiritus, inspire people to work for a greater good, a purpose greater than oneself, the common good for the greater good, and finally to do it every day. The virtue of habit, of something that I don't just choose to do selectively, but this is who I am, this is how I behave, these are the patterns of behavior that I try to imitate every day in every encounter that I have with each person I meet. Robert Greenleaf in 1970 was asked about servant leadership, and he said, here's the best test. Because of your service and leadership, are people healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves become servants and leaders? And then here's the moral imperative. And what is the effect on the least privileged in society. When you look back in terms of this last 20 months, what could be more important than a leader being concerned about the health and well-being of their employees, family members, community members? Are people healthier? Are they wiser? Are they able to discern what is good and right and just? Our people are autonomous. Are they able to act independently and interdependently with each other? Are they more likely to become servants themselves? Are they willing to demonstrate a commitment to the common good by putting aside personal interests for a good greater than themselves? Are they willing to take up the mantle of leadership, to step forward, to take on a level of responsibility in caring for the people entrusted to their care? And then that moral imperative, and what is the effect on the least privileged society? Isn't it extraordinary? Isn't it extraordinary that right now, National Guards people across this country have been sent to hospitals that are being overwhelmed by people who are sick? The most vulnerable are being taken care of by fellow citizens. Isn't it extraordinary the number of people who have found themselves opening up their homes in Kentucky to people whose houses were destroyed? Isn't it extraordinary how in each classroom in this country today, people go into schools teaching the least privileged, those children who are dependent upon schools, not only for knowledge, but for breakfast and for lunch? And so that moral imperative, it's no great achievement to work with those who are most privileged. What's really important is to put aside my self-interest for the interest of people greater than that are less fortunate than myself. To those who much has been given, much is expected in return. And Greenleaf, who was the vice president of AT&T Corporation, not only thought that would be important for individuals, he thought it to be important for institutions as well. So what he was concerned about is developing individual leaders who would become institutional leaders. For he understood, as we understand, that our institutions are the ways in which we lay hands on the world.
So it seems to me, in listening to this, and you and I have known each other for a number of years, and we've talked a lot about this, but as a business person, this would just make good sense to practice these virtues, to practice servant leadership. Why don't we see more leaders practicing in this way?
Well, you cannot be a righteous person by yourself. This is the teaching of the Jewish Talmud. You need the support of other people. You need friends. You need colleagues. You need people who are willing to speak the truth to you in order to help us remain moral. I cannot be a moral person by myself. I need the help, the encouragement, the honesty, the truth, the commitment of other people. How many leaders feel themselves to be isolated and alone, alienated, or even abandoned? When I speak to business leaders, people talk about, oh, it's lonely at the top. Guess what? It's lonely at the top. I can't tell you how many times I end up speaking to groups of people and people come up in tears and say, I don't have a friend. At Gallup organization has in employee engagement has always asked the question, do you have a good friend at work? How important that is. Then nature in terms of friendship. But leadership, I think it's very important to go back and look at the word. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon word leadeth, which means to step forward. And what you find happening is that Greenleaf called it a journey. What is a journey? A step forward each and every day. But leadership, L-A-I-D-T-H, leadeth, also the root word for the word load. So when you step forward, now you carry the load, you bear the burden. Well, think about in the last 20 months, how difficult that has been for so many people. How do you carry the load? How do you bear the burden by yourself? I mean, these are extraordinary times. So you have to ask a leader, not only is who are you? Whose are you? Who are the people that surround you? Who do you belong to? Who are the people that support you, encourage you, and challenge you each and every day to continue to take that step forward?
So I'm always astounded. I will talk with folks across the country and mention the work that Viterbo is doing in servant leadership, and it resonates. People are familiar with the term. I've had people say, "Oh, I love this idea," and yet, so one would think that there would just be a big national movement, and I know there is of sorts. What do you think the biggest misperception is about servant leadership?
Well, one of the things that I hear is soft. Oh, that's soft skills. Well, I'd like to take that comment down. What would be the opposite of soft? Hard? Well, I
and that's
guess,
kind of valued in our world in a way,
Well,
right?
well, it is in the short term. Oh, yeah, you can be hard, you can be harsh. But why is it then that so many people are resigning their jobs? Why is it that many people do not return to the workplace? Because they were not treated with dignity and respect. Also, I think that those terms are rather misogynistic. Oh, soft skills. Oh, those are feminine. Really? How many women do we know that are just strong, thoughtful, compassionate, courageous in the care for other people? To be empathetic is soft. What we understand today is empathy becomes a skill that can be learned. But it is so important to human relationships, and everything depends on our ability to build relationships with other people. Trust, forgiveness, patience, not soft. Those are virtues, strengths of character. Also, indications of people's souls, the deepest part of themselves. Aristotle, picked up by Thomas Aquinas, said our role is to become magnanimous, great-souled. Robert Greenleaf later said, our task is to live extraordinary lives and then bring the quality of our lives to the world of work. And people are hungry, anxious to participate in communities, cultures, organizations, where people are called to that sense of magnanimity, to be greater than what you thought was possible. Who wants to be mediocre? Who wants to be below average? I think this is what's very important in reaching out to our young. Not to be unrealistic, but can we begin to point them to a vision that says you are important and the work you do is significant, not only to yourself, but to others?
Speaking of strong women, obviously Viterbo was founded by a group of very strong women, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. How has that relationship informed your work over the years, your understanding of the Franciscan values? I know that you talk often about those Franciscan values as running through the work you do.
Well, I think for people that are not familiar, please understand that 85% of all healthcare institutions in this country are founded by groups of religious women. Women who are willing to take care of people who are not being taken care of in other ways. Rather extraordinary. Women who came to teach immigrant children, women who lived in community and formed orphanages and social service programs. Just rather extraordinary in terms of gathering together for a greater good. When I first came to Viterbo, there were 35 Franciscan sisters living and working here. I was hired by Sister Rita Dopkins, who was a scripture scholar. She graduated from St. Mary's University, which is the sister university of Notre Dame. She got her master's degree in scripture and theology, and she was standing in line with her cap and gown on at Notre Dame. And they pointed her and said, "No, sister, I think you're in the wrong line." And she said, "I'm a graduate student." This is 1968, standing for her rights as a scholar and as a leader. She hired me. She taught me. She supported me. And we became lifelong friends. Sister Lorian Peterek had her bachelor's degree in chemistry, her master's in English literature, her doctorate in philosophy that she studied with only men. They had to appoint a dean of woman for Lorian. They would have debates on Wednesday afternoons in Greek and Latin. She studied philosophy from 15th century Greek texts that were written on sheepskin. Woman was incredibly brilliant. She spoke 3 different languages. She forgot more than I'd ever known. I had the privilege of teaching with her, and she taught me. So my life was only possible by these women who gave me a chance, who saw things in me I did not see in myself, who supported me and encouraged me. My life is grace dependent, and I'm eternally grateful for the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. When we moved here, I have no family living here. Sisters were surrogate grandmothers for my daughters who have never forgotten that they were loved.
Tom, you've been teaching the servant leadership program now for 20 years. And I'm wondering if you could characterize the kind of person that seems to be drawn to the study of servant leadership.
First, it's important for people who are listening that we come from the founders, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, and a mission to prepare people for lives of faithful service and ethical leadership. And you and I have had the conversation with people, well, why are you here? And they'll say, well, I don't know, I kind of had this call. I'm not exactly sure why I'm here, but I know I'm supposed to be here. These are faithful people who are discerning a vocation. What are you being called to? What kind of partnerships are available to help make the world a better place? It's extraordinary. It goes back to what Confucius says, the first step to becoming a leader is to become a good person. And I just feel so honored and blessed to be in the presence of good people who together were searching. If you would go back to Robert Greenleaf's idea of the servant as leader, it comes from his reading of Hermann Hesse's book, The Journey to the East, in which was a group of pilgrims who were on a journey together, seeking wisdom. I think that's what we understand. We are on a journey together, seeking wisdom. How is it that we can serve the common good for a greater good? And people come from all different kinds of backgrounds, whether it be engineering, business, teaching, healthcare, civic leadership. It is just extraordinary, but it's responding to a call.
What do you, I think a lot of people want to reduce servant leadership to a certain set of traits or a certain set of characteristics, traits, or a formula. What is, like, I know you gave a definition. Is servant leadership, is it a theory? Is it a strategy? Is it a goal? How would you describe it in relationship to other kinds of theories or conceptions about leadership?
Well, it is a philosophy that is transdisciplinary, and so therefore it's difficult to put it into any one particular category. And of course, we like to make things very compartmentalized, to kind of take the complexity out of our lives. How many times you read books in terms of here are the 10 steps that you have to follow. And after a while, you begin to recognize that those are really pretty shallow and not very helpful. But when you start to look at servant leadership, this is a way of life. This is how our character is formed. A couple of years ago, David Brooks wrote a book, The Road to Character, that became a bestseller. I think they were hungry to explore again what it is to be a person of character. And that's what happens with servant leadership. People come in and there's this information. So you kind of get the theory, the background, the research that begins to take place. You need, every discipline has a basis of knowledge, and our basis of knowledge comes from philosophy and theology, sociology, economics, psychology, the arts and the literature, poetry and drama is all part of it, because it's part of all of our lives. And then in every discipline, you need a level of formation. So we come together. One servant leader is not a servant leader. We are part of a community. And so we join into that community, and we learn so much more from each other than we could ever learn by ourselves. So sometimes I feel embarrassed that I'm receiving tuition when I'm receiving so much being the teacher in the class. It's just extraordinary because there's a level of personal formation that begins to take place when people share their life experience, their knowledge, and their insights with each other. And what that information formation leads to is experience in terms of transformation. People easily quote Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. Well, it means to be transformed. It means to continue to grow, to try to do things in ways that you hadn't done them previously. And all of a sudden, something new begins to take place. We have found this during the pandemic. Ricky brought in Bruce Feiler, who talked about life in transition and how important it is in leading through transitions, leading through changes. Well, I cannot lead others through those kind of change, any others through that levels of transformation, unless I'm participating in that myself. One of the things I hold true to is that you cannot lead people past where you are. So if I accept the role or the privilege of being a leader, then it's a commitment to ongoing growth, development, learning as much as I can, listening carefully to other people, having humility. I do not have all the answers. And so it's really a way of life, but a way of life that I cannot, even though I've chosen it, I cannot live alone. And that's when people say, I feel kind of called. And all of a sudden there's a level of support that begins to develop. What have we also understood here in the last 50 years? That emotional intelligence is so terribly important for our understanding of other people. How do we make connections with other people? The work of Daniel Goleman in terms is just extraordinary. And then what we're learning now from neuroscience, that literally we were created for connection. Richard Davidson, who's the director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, really doing pioneering work in neuroscience and leadership, was speaking at the Davos conference on economics 3 years ago before the pandemic. And he said this: a calm mind and a warm heart are skills that could be taught. And the leaders of the economic forum at Davos asked the question, how do we get this into the lives of our leaders? Calm mind and a warm heart are skills, but they come out of a discipline of contemplation and reflection, of dialogue and intentional action. That's what servant leadership is.
You talk quite a bit around the country to people in various organizations, professional associations, and so forth. What do you think is the question that is on most people's minds today? When like after the talk, you all or during the Q&A session, or after the talk, when you're sitting down, you're having dinner with folks and they're telling you about what's going on in their organizations. What are they wondering about?
Goodness. I think we have a false premise. And the false premise is that we're so divided. And people talk about division. Or I'm a little bit critical of consultants, and I am one. Consultants who come in and tell you, these are all the problems that we're facing, and I have the solutions. I start from another place. I start from the position of goodness. And wherever I'm going, I'm meeting good people that are doing good work. And I ask people, don't you agree that we need fresh water? Don't you believe that we need safe, affordable, accessible food? Don't you believe that we need neighborhoods that we can live in and feel safe? That our children need education that will teach them to be good people, as well as to inform them about the complexities of the world? Can't we agree that each of us believes that members of our family should be taken care of by qualified healthcare professionals? That we need police and fire protection in our communities? And all of a sudden, people, well, yes. Well, let's believe in the goodness of each other. So the examples that I just gave earlier, the number of people who open their homes to complete strangers in Kentucky, It's not just Southern hospitality. This is the way in which we treat people. This is how I'd want to be treated. If I don't have a place to live, would you take me in? National Guard people, young people that we have in our college classes who enter the National Guard in order for a little bit of money to help them through college, and then dedicate their lives in terms of service to our nation and to our world. The number of people who just went out of their way to welcome 13,000 Afghan guests to Fort McCoy. When people were asked, are you supportive of Afghan refugees coming to this country? 66% said yes. When the question was phrased, are you in favor of supporting Afghan refugees who helped our troops in Afghanistan? 88% of the people said yes. Why? Because it's right and good and just. And if you start with that premise, it's not that I'm Pollyannish. It's not that I understand that there's violence. Certainly, I'm worried about the levels of despair and suicide. Certainly, I'm concerned about violence. But I'm also really believing in so many people who each and every day are good people doing good work, paying their taxes, providing for their families, caring about people other than themselves. And I think we have plenty of examples that show that to us each and every day. Whatever you pay attention to, you get more of. Rick, for those of you who are just listening, is the director of our Ethics and Leadership Center here at Viterbo University and brings thought leaders to our community, how important it is to have good ideas. And he brought to us Daniel Allen, who written a book on the Declaration of Independence. And I must admit, I hadn't read it that carefully until I read her book. And it's a book that I'll continue to go back to. But I've memorized the last line of the Declaration of Independence. With the belief in divine providence, we commit our lives, our fortune, and our sacred trust. The premise of the nation, of our being together, is a commitment of our lives, our fortune, our sacred trust. I'm a person of faith. That's the same thing that I believe that happens each and every day. Robert Greenleaf then reflects that. And what is the effect on the least privileged society? So why is it that those gentlemen who signed the Declaration were willing to give their lives for farmers, their wives, their children for us? Well, because they believed in something greater than themselves. And so that's what happens when I just enunciate these things. Well, yeah, that sounds right. That seems to be common sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was Ben Franklin who said, well, common sense isn't all that common.
Greenleaf also talked quite a bit about institutions, and he talked about the institution as servants. And you had mentioned the institutions as the way we lay hands on the world and the extraordinary importance of them. And yet we have like all-time levels of distrust in institutions in the country. Is there a way to restore trust and confidence in our institutions?
Well, first, trust is a secret sauce in every relationship. What is it? It's not policy, it's not budgets, it's our relationships with each other, and trust is earned over time. Now, one of the problems that I see is the level of what I call the deconstruction of institutions. So you listen to conversations. I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. It's a legal system. Shakespeare was right. Kill those lawyers first. Well, I come from a family of attorneys. But what's extraordinary? Get rid of all the lawyers, but the moment I have to go to court, well, I want a good lawyer. I'll tell you what's wrong with this country, the healthcare, those doctors and those nurses that make so much money, going and living in those big fancy houses, going to big. But the moment I'm sick, well, I want the best doctor available. I'll tell you what's wrong with this country, the education system. What kind of work is that? Go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, done at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you got the whole summer off. But the moment my son or daughter, my grandchild is in school, I want the best teacher available. I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. It's those politicians. I don't care if it's Senator Madison or Washington, D.C. or St. Paul. But the tornado hits in Kentucky. Well, where's the government? Where's FEMA? I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. It's a church. You've been in one of those churches recently? All they want to do is get in your pocket. The money. Oh, let's criticize all the religious institutions. But at the moment that I'm in a moment of sorrow, when the community has no place to gather, well, where's the church? So one of the interesting things, it's a paradox, isn't it? We're constantly involved in the deconstruction of our institutions, yet wanting to be served.
Mhm.
And so I think that one of the ways in which I regain, if you will, a trust in my own institution is that the trust in myself and my level of responsibility. The Declaration of Independence says, we the people.
Mhm.
The Catholic Church, in terms of Vatican Council, the church tradition from which I come from, the people of God. Well, I'm one of those people. Doesn't say the Pope, but isn't it rather interesting that we put people in terms of positions, and then we expect them to do everything for us. And I think we abdicate our levels of responsibility
Mhm.
rather than taking what is my level of responsibility. I have a brother who's now retired, was a district attorney of Adams County here in Wisconsin, high levels of poverty and high levels of violence. And he stayed as a district attorney for over 33 and a half years. My brother interviewed and worked with victims of crime who had the fingerprints of evil all over their lives, trying to bring compassion. But each and every day, he worked for justice, not prosecutions, which our state constitution says you must do. Find justice for the victim, for the citizens, for the perpetrator. And he said this, the justice system only works if there's people within the system who are committed to justice. The healthcare system only works if there are people in the system who are committed to the health and well-being of other people. The educational system only works if there's people who are in the system who are dedicated to the education of other people's children. So what is my own personal level of responsibility as a member of not of a nameless institution, but as an institution that has responsibility for a good greater than themselves? And what Greenleaf believed that we have to be able to raise the level of capacity of institutions to care for the people entrusted to their care. So this is a process of constant critique, improvement, and growth. And as I look around, I tell you what, right now, if I needed surgery in the city of La Crosse, I would receive surgery, therapy, ongoing care, and well-being in extraordinary ways. Robotic surgeries, in which people are not spending 2 weeks in a hospital, but maybe 3 hours. It's an extraordinary diagnosis. What we're able to do right now with a COVID test and get the results within 4 hours. Where 2 years ago, we didn't even have that available to us. Think about the capacity in terms of education to move on Zoom and to continue to educate children online with technological capacity that we didn't even know that we had. Are we there yet? No, but it's rather extraordinary. Think about it for just a moment. The institution of the United States military that in 13 days were able to transport over 120,000 people safely to countries around the globe. Were there casualties? Yes. War is chaos. But it's extraordinary that people were given safe passage and are now being housed and fed, educated, and given the possibility of resuming their lives. Extraordinary. Let's look to the people within those institutions. And the institution, there's that military, most of those people, I would guess, are under the age of 25, who are willing to serve people that they had never met previously.
You hit on so much there. Just digesting this idea of reciprocity, of trust, of compassion, of understanding. Let me ask you about another virtue, though, one that I think, we've got cause to celebrate right now, which is hospitality. As I mentioned earlier, Place of Grace, which you were integral in founding, is celebrating 25 years this year. Why is it so important for us to show hospitality, and why, in many ways, have we forgotten this virtue?
Well, one of the things that we share in common is our appreciation of language. And hospitality comes from a Greek term, hospes, Hospes, which means guest. A hospital, you're a guest. The children that we've been blessed with, they're guests in our life. We don't own our children. They live with us, they move out, they leave their stuff, they come back, they move out.
Most of the time,
They still leave their stuff.
stuff.
But they're guests in our lives, and we begin to recognize that the people that we teach, they're guests in our lives. What is it that many businesses are talking about now? It's not talking about customers, they're talking about their guests, guest services, to treat other person as a guest in our life. We spend the majority of our lives in the company of strangers. Rick and I have been teaching together for 20 years. Every semester, there's a new group of young people entrusted to our care. And we create a hospitable place because they're guests in our lives for 4 months. How extraordinary that is. Not as a consumer that I think I'm going to get a transactional reaction. If I'm good to you, you'll be good to me. This is what I have to offer. How important and significant that is. When I was growing up, I had that experience. Our backyard was always open. My mother in the summertime was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, bologna sandwiches. People would come by, and there'd be kids eating sandwiches in the backyard and drinking Kool-Aid, red dye number 5, which explains a number of things about my generation. I had a friend one time, his name was Buster Hankey, and Buster came over, and my mother said, "Buster, you need a haircut." "Yeah, I know, Mrs. Thibodeau. My mom's not been able to take me to the barber. She said, sit down." And she cut his hair and sent him home. Mrs. Hankey called and said, "Thank you, Janine. I didn't have time to bring Buster to the barber. My mother was a beautician." Can you imagine that happening today? What happened is that group in that neighborhood depended upon the hospitality of each other to care for each other's children. And we did. That sense in terms of welcome. Many of us grew up in a family where our parents would make a little extra, never knowing if somebody's going to drop by. Mm-hmm. Remember, we used to use that wonderful word, visit. We would drop in and just visit with people. And how extraordinary that is when you go to other parts of the world and see people standing in a street corner just visiting with each other. The sense of hospitality, making space in our lives for the guest. How important and significant it is. Now, where did we learn that? Well, in our family of origin and in the communities that we belong to. When I was growing up, my mother was very hospitable. My grandmother was very hospitable. That's what we believed in. This is how we were raised. People were welcomed at our house. My brother spoke at my mother's funeral. And he said, "Mother was always hospitable. You're always welcomed at Mother's house." After my dad died, my mother was out at the mailbox, making sure that the mailman got a couple of cookies. The person who checked the meter always got invited in for a cup of coffee. She couldn't help herself but to be hospitable. But my brother said, hospitality is predicated on generosity. To have a generous spirit, to be generous with our patience, to be generous with our kindness, to be generous with our compassion. We can do that during the Christmas season, but why not all year long? The level in terms of generosity that just kind of expands our lives and our world. He said to the grandchildren, every year at Christmas, Grandma would say, "How much can I give the grandchildren?" She said my brother said, Mom was on a fixed income, so she didn't have much money. So I'd say, "Well, Mother, maybe $5. She says, "Can I give him 20? And he looked at all the grandchildren. He said, "You always got 20. Grandma couldn't help herself but to be generous. That was her spirit." And I would dare say that many of us, if we look back into our family, see how generous people were, shared with what they had, and they didn't have much, but it was a generosity of spirit. We see this in so many different places. And finally, he said, but generosity is predicated on gratitude. You will not be generous unless you are grateful. And my mother began to perceive that everything she had was a gift. Everything that she received, any little act of goodness. So she'd be traveling downtown Wisconsin Rapids, a magical, mystical place, and she'd see an empty parking space, and she'd say, well, it was right there in front of the dollar store. Well, of course, God is preparing her a place to go and shop for the day. She'd go to the store, and because she's on a fixed income, she'd see a piece of steak and be marked down, and she'd buy it, but then she'd call over a friend because who wants to have a steak dinner by themselves? And she was just grateful. She just saw those as little graces. When my mother was dying of congestive heart failure and she knew she didn't have much time left, she had a roll of masking tape on her kitchen table. And just like my grandmother, you go to her house and she said, what do you want? Well, mother, I don't want to have that conversation. Listen, I don't have much. I don't want you kids fighting over it. I want to give you all something. What would you like? And I said, well, mother, I like those 2 little black chairs you have in the living room. Oh, she said, I know you like those. I'm giving those to Mark, my brother. I got her dishes instead. But the importance was it was all gift, and therefore she could give it away. She didn't claim it for herself. Well, think about that for just a moment. How about our natural world? Is not clean water a gift? Clean air? Safe streets? Isn't our democracy a gift? Don't we talk about faith as being a gift? The knowledge that I receive from other people who have studied hard so I might learn things that I could have never learned without their gift of generosity and knowledge. It generates a level of gratitude. So hospitality is predicated on generosity. Generosity is predicated on gratitude. And these are virtues that each of us can practice each and every day.
Oh, well, Tom, one of the many things I love about you is I could enter a room with you feeling however I'm feeling that day. And it could be the lowest low to the highest high. And you will lift me higher regardless of where I am. You've just given us so many wonderful things to think about here. What gives you hope for the future? Or are you hopeful? I mean, I sense that it radiates off of you.
Well, but the 3 of you give me hope. Good friends give me hope. I don't have the strength in and of myself. The Franciscan Sister of Perpetual Adoration, whose average age is 78, right now, our 2 sisters are in the chapel praying for us each and every day of my life. That gives me hope. My daughters give me hope, but they're only representative of a generation of people who are concerned about the environment and each other, families, neighborhoods, a livable way of life. They're concerned about a peaceful existence or coexistence, wanting to travel again, to be engaged with the people of the world. This gives me hope. People working on the front lines of justice each and every day, making sure that people who don't have enough to eat or a place to live are taken care of. Every mall in every country, in every county, in every state in our country has a giving tree where complete strangers are buying a Christmas present for a child who would not have Christmas without their generosity. That gives me hope. People who come from different backgrounds working together for a greater good. That gives me hope. People who have developed the skills and the ability to build houses and to put together bridges, to be able to create opportunities that we're able to travel safely. That gives me hope. Farmers who go out into their barns every day, twice a day, to produce the food that I have the possibility of eating and enjoying. That gives me hope. I love what Augustine said in the 4th century. He said, hope has 2 sisters, anger and courage. Be angry with injustice, but then have the courage to change it. It's not enough just to be a denouncer. You have to also announce possibility. And that's what I find. I find myself attracted to people who are doing that kind of good work. each and every day. And I am not disappointed.
Well, and what's simply remarkable, Tom, is you've lived your life with those precepts as well. You've gone and done good work.
Most of the time. Let's just be honest right here. If my wife was sitting in the room right now, you'd get a much more honest impression, and she'd say, he's better than he was, but he's still got room to improve.
Hey, better than he was, isn't that what we all want on our tombstone?
I hope so.
I would relish that being the opening line of my obituary. Well, he's better than he was.
I'm not sure I'd want that on my tombstone. That he's better dead than he was.
Yeah,
alive.
that's true.
There might be another occasion for it, but not on the tombstone.
Yeah, true,
Kind of
true.
brings us back to where we started this conversation. Rick Kite, he was a fine man.
Thank you.
A Minnesotan.
Well, Tom Thibodeau, thank you so much for joining us. You've given us so much wisdom and wonderful things to think about, and you lift our spirits along the way. And I appreciate not only the fact that you've done all this good work for so many years, but that every day you lace up your boots and you keep doing the good work. So thank you for being an inspiring leader and for helping us to better articulate what leadership really can do.
Well, thank you for your friendship and the opportunity to be in conversation and community with all of you.